There's a community in the United States that represents approximately 2% of the population. That same community represents 25% of the Forbes 400 wealthiest Americans, roughly 30 to 40% of Ivy League student bodies, a disproportionate share of Nobel Prize winners in economics. A cultural and intellectual tradition with a relationship to money, education, and community obligation that is unlike almost anything else in American life. The Jewish community. Now, before we go any further, I want to be direct about what this video is and what it isn't. This is not a video about genetics or innate ability. It's not a video that traffics in stereotypes or treats Jewish wealth as monolithic, because it isn't. There are millions of Jewish Americans living ordinary middle-class lives. There are impoverished Jewish communities. The wealth concentration at the top of that community's distribution is not universal to every Jewish household. What this video is about is the financial philosophy embedded in thousands of years of Jewish religious and cultural tradition, specifically in the Talmud, in the concept of tzedakah, in the historical practices around commerce and community, that represent a genuinely distinct framework for thinking about money. Principles that are documented, studied, and increasingly cited by economists and behavioral finance researchers as containing real, actionable wisdom that has nothing to do with ethnicity and everything to do with values and decision-making. These are ideas that any person from any background can examine, understand, and choose to apply. That's what we're doing today, so let's get into it. To understand Jewish financial philosophy, you have to understand the circumstances that shaped it, because these principles didn't emerge from abundance. They emerged from survival. For roughly 2 millennia, Jewish communities across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East lived under conditions of profound legal and economic insecurity. In medieval Europe, Jews were frequently barred from owning land, the primary store of wealth in agrarian economies. They were prohibited from most trade guilds. They were subject to expulsion at a ruler's whim. And expulsion happened repeatedly. England in 1290, France in 1306, and again in 1394. Spain in 1492, Austria, Lithuania, various German states across the following centuries. What do you do when you cannot own land, when the primary store of wealth in your civilization is legally unavailable to you? When you know that physical property can be seized, that your community can be forced to leave with days of notice? You build wealth in forms that travel, knowledge, skills, relationships, financial instruments. And you build community structures that protect and redistribute wealth across the group, because individual wealth without community is fragile in ways that collective wealth is not. These were not abstract philosophical choices. They were adaptive strategies developed under existential pressure over generations, and the financial principles that emerged from them, documented in the Talmud, practiced in Jewish communities across the diaspora, turn out to be extraordinarily aligned with what modern behavioral finance research says produces long-term wealth. The connection between historical necessity and financial wisdom is not coincidental. Constraints, applied consistently over generations, produce principles. And some of those principles are worth understanding on their own terms, regardless of their origin. The Talmud, the central text of Rabbinic Judaism compiled between roughly 200 and 500 CE, contains a remarkable amount of practical financial guidance embedded within its religious and legal discussions. One of the most cited is a passage from the tractate Bava Metzia that prescribes a specific framework for organizing personal wealth. The principle, paraphrased from the original Aramaic, a person should divide their assets into 3 equal portions. 1/3 in land, meaning fixed, stable assets, 1/3 in commerce, meaning working capital, liquid investments, the money used to generate more money, and 1/3 available, meaning cash or near cash, liquid reserves for opportunity and emergency. Read that in 2026 financial language and it sounds like 1/3 in real assets and long-term investments, 1/3 in active investments in business, 1/3 in liquid savings and cash equivalents. The portfolio construction this describes, diversified across asset types with a specific allocation to liquidity, is essentially what modern financial planners recommend as the structure for a sound personal balance sheet. Not 100% in equities, not all cash, not all real estate, a deliberate division that balances growth, income, and security. What's remarkable about this is not just the similarity to modern advice. It's that this framework was codified 1,500 years before modern portfolio theory. Harry Markowitz won the Nobel Prize in 1990 for mathematically formalizing diversification as a risk management strategy. The Talmud was teaching a version of this principle to Jewish merchants and tradespeople in the 4th century. Now apply it concretely to a modern $80,000 household income. After taxes, roughly $62,000 in take-home, 1/3 to stable long-term assets, real estate equity, retirement accounts, index funds, approximately $20,600 a year, or $1,717 a month. 1/3 to working capital and active income generation, business investment, skill development, tools that produce income, another $20,600, 1/3 liquid, emergency fund, opportunity fund, near cash savings, the remaining third. Most people hearing this will immediately say, I can't save 2/3 of my income, that's insane. And they're right, not as a starting point, not as a rigid prescription, but as a directional framework for how to think about money allocation. It reorients the entire conversation. Instead of asking, how much can I save after I spend, it asks, how do I deliberately divide what comes in before I spend anything? That's a fundamentally different relationship with income. The Israeli financial educator and author Avraham Alon has written extensively about how this Talmudic framework, which he traces through generations of Ashkenazi and Sephardic business practice, produced a cultural orientation toward asset diversity and liquidity that protected Jewish communities from total financial devastation even during periods of persecution. When you had to leave everything and run, the third that was liquid went with you. The education, the human capital, the relationships went with you. The land did not. Portability of wealth. That principle, born from necessity, maps remarkably well onto modern financial advice about not being over-concentrated in any single illiquid asset. This is the principle that requires the most explanation, because on the surface it appears to directly contradict financial common sense. Tzedakah, often translated as charity, but more precisely meaning justice or righteousness, is the Jewish obligation to give a portion of income to those in need. Unlike the English word charity, which implies a voluntary act of generosity, tzedakah in Jewish law is obligatory. It is a financial requirement, not a suggestion. The Talmud sets the standard giving level at 1/10 of earnings, the same proportion, interestingly, as the biblical tithe in the Christian tradition. The Rambam, the medieval Jewish philosopher and physician Moses Maimonides, developed an 8-level hierarchy of tzedakah in the 12th century, from the lowest level, giving grudgingly, to the highest, helping someone become self-sufficient so they no longer need assistance. His framework is one of the earliest documented philosophical treatments of poverty alleviation as a system rather than an individual act. Here's where the paradox enters. A financial philosophy that requires giving away 10% of income before optimizing savings, investment, or consumption. That should make it harder to build wealth, not easier. And yet the communities that have practiced tzedakah most consistently as a cultural norm have, historically, demonstrated some of the highest rates of wealth accumulation across generations. Modern research is starting to explain why. And the explanation turns out to have nothing to do with divine reward, and everything to do with network economics, psychological orientation, and community resilience. Arthur Brooks, an economist who has published extensively on the relationship between giving and financial well-being, found in his research that people who give to others consistently report higher levels of life satisfaction and demonstrate stronger financial trajectories than non-givers at comparable income levels. His analysis of IRS data and survey research found that charitable giving is positively correlated with income growth over time, not because wealthy people give more, though they do, but because giving behavior itself appears to reinforce the financial habits and community relationships that produce wealth. The mechanism has several layers. First, giving is a form of deliberate scarcity. It forces you to live on less, which develops the same financial muscle as saving. A household that gives 10% and saves 20% on a $70,000 net income has trained itself to live on $49,000. That training is identical in its financial effect to aggressive saving. The difference is that the motivation is external and values-based rather than purely self-interested, which behaviorally tends to produce more consistent follow-through. Second, and this is the network economics piece, communities that practice mutual financial obligation build trust networks that create economic opportunity. The Jewish concept of gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness that include interest-free loans between community members, produced historically access to credit in communities where formal banking was unavailable or discriminatory. The Talmud discusses interest-free loans at length, establishing frameworks for lending within the community that provided capital access without the exploitative terms of external lenders. In modern terms, a community where people are obligated to support each other financially creates a distributed safety net that allows individual members to take risks they couldn't take alone. If you know your community will not let you starve, you are more willing to start a business, to invest aggressively, to take the income move we talked about in the last video. The obligation flows both ways. You give when others need it, and when you need it, the community gives back. Harvard sociologist Robert Putnam's research on social capital, the value created by community trust and relationships, found that high social capital communities demonstrate better economic outcomes at every income level than comparable communities with lower social cohesion. The Jewish communal model, with its embedded financial obligations and mutual aid structures, is one of the clearest historical examples of high social capital producing economic resilience. The paradox resolves like this. Giving first doesn't reduce wealth. It builds the discipline, the network, and the community infrastructure that enable wealth to grow more sustainably than individual accumulation alone would allow. We've talked about the 1/10 as a giving standard. There's a parallel principle in Jewish tradition around consumption, specifically around spending on items that depreciate or that are purely status-driven. The historical practice, documented across various rabbinic sources and oral tradition, is sometimes framed as spending no more than 1/10 of your income on things that don't hold or produce value. Not 1/10 of total spending, 1/10 of earnings as a ceiling on consumptive, status-driven purchases. The house is practical, the education is generative, the business investment is productive. The luxury car, the designer clothing, the expensive watch, these fall under the consumption ceiling. This maps almost exactly onto what Thomas Stanley documented in his research for The Millionaire Next Door. Stanley found that actual American millionaires, not the celebrities and athletes, but the ordinary people who accumulated wealth over working lifetimes, spent dramatically less on status consumption than their incomes would suggest. They drove ordinary cars. They lived in modest homes relative to their net worth. They bought quality but not luxury. They had internalized, through some combination of values and financial clarity, a distinction between spending that builds and spending that performs. The distinction matters enormously in 2026 specifically. We are living in the peak era of status consumption as a social norm. Social media has created a global stage for displaying consumption in real time, and the algorithmic recommendation engines we discussed in the Comfort Trap video are optimized to convert social comparison into purchase decisions. The person without a values-based framework for consumption is essentially defenseless against this. The spending just happens, guided by social anxiety and algorithmic nudging, and the financial plan suffers for it. A 1/10 ceiling on non-productive consumption creates a forcing function. On a $70,000 take-home income, that's $7,000 a year, $583 a month, for all status and lifestyle spending combined. The car upgrade, the new clothes, the nice dinners out, the vacation that's more about Instagram than genuine experience, all of it comes out of that $583 bucket. When the bucket is empty, the answer is no, not because you can't afford it, because the framework says no. That might sound harsh. What it actually is, as anyone who has lived by a clear financial framework knows, is liberating. When the decision is already made at the values level, every individual purchase doesn't require a new deliberation. The mental energy that used to go into, can I justify this, goes somewhere more productive. The financial resources that used to leak into status consumption go somewhere more productive. And the psychological security of knowing your consumption is bounded, that you're not one impulse buy away from undermining your savings plan, is worth something that doesn't show up in any financial model. There's one more principle from Jewish tradition that belongs in this conversation, and it's the one with perhaps the clearest empirical backing: the obligation to educate, specifically the Talmudic principle attributed to Rabbi Judah the Prince, that a father is obligated to teach his son a trade, not just Torah, not just religious practice, a marketable skill, a way to generate income. The religious and the practical were not separated in rabbinic financial thinking. Both were obligations and both were investments in future capability. Jewish communities throughout history have had dramatically higher literacy rates than surrounding populations, not because of religious favoritism, but because reading the Torah required literacy, and literacy turned out to be economically valuable in every economy that valued information handling, commerce, and record keeping. The investment in education as a religious obligation produced an economically valuable skill as a side effect. More broadly, the cultural emphasis on education within Jewish families across generations, the value placed on academic achievement, on professional attainment, on the acquisition of portable, valuable knowledge, is extensively documented as a primary driver of Jewish economic mobility in the United States. Sociologists Seymour Martin Lipset and Earl Robb, writing about Jewish economic success in America, identified educational investment as the central mechanism through which successive generations of Jewish immigrants moved from poverty to professional class within 1 to 2 generations. This is not a story about genes or innate intelligence. It is a story about where a community directs its resources, its attention, and its children's time. Education was not just encouraged, it was obligatory. And obligations that are culturally enforced produce outcomes that optional suggestions do not. The research on intergenerational wealth transmission consistently finds that education is the most reliable vehicle for moving up the wealth distribution across generations. Not gifts of money. Gifts of money without financial education often evaporate within 1 generation, not real estate alone. Education, and specifically the kind that leads to high demand, portable skills, is what moves families permanently up the income distribution rather than temporarily. Jewish tradition codified this as a community obligation over a millennium before the economics research confirmed it. That's not mystical. That's a community that figured out, through trial and error across many generations, what actually works. Let's pull all 4 principles into a single framework and look at what they produce collectively. Because they don't work as isolated rules, they work as a system. The third allocation ensures that wealth is diversified across stable assets, working capital, and liquidity. No single category absorbs everything. No single risk can wipe you out entirely. The structure mirrors what modern financial planners prescribe, but it comes from a tradition that understood the value of that diversification before the mathematics existed to explain it. The tzedakah obligation creates a giving floor that builds community capital, develops financial discipline through deliberate scarcity, and embeds the individual in a network of mutual obligation that provides both safety and opportunity. It transforms money from a purely individual resource into a community resource. And community resources are more resilient than individual ones. The 1/10 ceiling on consumptive spending protects the wealth-building capacity of income from the single greatest threat to it in 2026. The social and algorithmic pressure to perform financial success through visible consumption. It creates a values-based decision rule that removes the cognitive load from individual purchase decisions and redirects resources toward productive uses. And the education imperative, the obligation to acquire and transmit portable, valuable knowledge across generations, ensures that the human capital side of wealth building keeps pace with the financial capital side. Knowledge is the one form of wealth that cannot be seized, inflated away, or lost in a market crash. Apply these 4 principles to a household earning $100,000 today. Give 10%, $7,000 a year, to causes or community you believe in. Cap consumptive spending at 10%, another $7,000. What's left? $56,000 to allocate across stable assets, working capital, and liquidity in rough thirds. Invest continuously in skills and education, build and maintain relationships of mutual financial trust and support. That framework, executed consistently over 20 years, builds more wealth than almost any specific investment strategy. Not because it picks better stocks or times the market, because it aligns daily financial behavior with a set of values that compound in account balances, in community capital, in human capital, in psychological security, in ways that purely technical financial strategies do not. Here's what I want you to take from this. These principles are thousands of years old. They were developed by communities under conditions of legal exclusion, physical insecurity, and economic constraint that most of us will never experience. They have been practiced, refined, and transmitted across generations in some of the most difficult circumstances human beings have faced. And they work, not because of anything mystical, because they encode in the language of religious obligation the financial behaviors that modern economics and behavioral finance research have independently confirmed produce long-term wealth and resilience. You don't have to be Jewish to use them. You don't have to adopt any religious framework. You don't have to give exactly 10% or divide your assets into exactly equal thirds. What you can do is take the underlying principles, diversify across asset types with deliberate liquidity, give in ways that build community and financial discipline simultaneously, cap consumptive spending through a values-based framework rather than willpower, and invest in education as a primary wealth-building vehicle, and apply them to the financial life you're actually living. These aren't rules from a different world. They're rules from a community that figured out, across a very long time and under very hard conditions, what actually works. That's worth paying attention to.